The first notices were about the sky. Maesters in the citadel took turns on the eastern gallery with their ink-shilled fingers wrapped in wool, scoring down that the aurora had returned in the wrong month. They argued whether it had ever been the right month, and one of them, little more than a boy, wrote that the green lights were cramped and angrier, as if grappling with a rope tugged from the far north. That same week, a harbor master in White Harbor wrote to his cousin upriver that the bay had gone quiet even in storm, as if the sea were listening, and that dogs paced restlessly whenever the night bent to listen back. A raven from Last Hearth arrived with its feet frozen together, and the ring of ice around its legs had to be cracked with a spoon. On the inside of the ring there was a smudge of blue no one had seen before. Tails walk faster than snow. Hunters from the new forest boundary came in with eyes like flints and claimed they had seen a shape far out on the frozen flats that moved like weather. They said the wind changed to follow it, and the hush behind it was not empty but full of waiting. At Eastwatch, the men who had taken to sleeping in the rookery because the rebuilt barracks groaned at every frost told each other that the storm had learned the roadways torn from the wall and was parading them under the stars. A woman who baked oatcakes for those same men sent her brother a message with a sun carved on the wax. Sometimes, before dawn, there was the print of a great wolf in the snow, and sometimes there was no print at all but the smell of ice, like steel. When the first free folk stragglers returned, not fleeing but stunned, they spoke in low voices to the hearth and not to the Lord's chair. He had come, they said, from the line of trees where the old gods are still allowed to whisper. There was a long white animal with him that did not steam in cold, and the dead walked at his shoulder and did not touch them. He had looked at a group of children hiding in the ruins of a stone ring, and the dead had turned their heads away. They called him by the name they had given him when all of them were half-starving and snowblind years ago, the little raven with the big heart. Others called him by a different name. The word was pushed around a table in Winterfell to see who would touch it without flinching. Letters to Winterfell came with the fat seal of White Harbor and the stern straight line of Bear Island, with the ram of the hills and the crowned merman, and most of them said that the first duty was to children and grain. They said fires must be banked but ready, and timber must be bought from the sisters, even though the sisters smiled when they sent invoices. They asked if the old horn and the old vows counted for anything now that the horn was cracked and the vows had been broken by necessity so many times they sounded like a prayer for rain. In the hall, a steward who had not slept much leaned to the new maester and asked if there was a rule about how to address a brother who had become a story. It went south on quiet feet, as news tends to do when it is too large for the corridors that carry it. In King's Landing, the whisperers who were now tax clerks because it pleased the crown to be honest about the cost of listening wrote short memoranda in neat hands that said the North was anxious but not yet mutinous. They said that traders out of the Bight observed a slow caravan of pale travelers crossing the distant flats like a procession of moths, and that the last 2 hours of the night turned the horizon to iron. They said the word that the North did not want to touch. They set it down once each, then drew a line beneath it so they would not write it twice and cheapen the omen. Opinions were inexhaustible and the winter was not. The men who had walked the old wall and seen it broken questioned whether a king could be born from something shattered, while a stonemason in Old Town who had never seen winter at all said kings are always born from ruin, and people nodded because the fire was low. In Winterfell, someone told the story that he had turned his face willingly to the heart tree and lowered himself to his knees, so that the power that once had answered to another would bind itself to a name that remembered warmth. Another someone said he had died and cursed them all with blue eyes for being so stupid as to hope he could live. Yet another remembered the way his hand used to straighten a child's cloak at the edges and said that however it had happened, whatever he had chosen or not chosen, the dead were different now that they had learned to step aside. The first decree was made without trumpets. A quiet scribe in the Red Keep set down that all bodies within the 6 kingdoms must be burned within a day and not interred, that the old songs about dust to dust were postponed until better weather. A priest of the 7 broke his quill when he saw it and later apologized to the quill, as if it were a small thing he had harmed. The faith spoke in sorrow and then in rising heat about blasphemy, while the Red Temple spoke of mercy and leaned into the sudden gust of devotees with their palms tender from splinters and smell of smoke in their hair. Oil merchants in Gulltown wore mournful faces and counted coins twice, once for themselves and once for the idea of being useful. There were small fires on hills and large fires in market squares. The work of tending them became a new profession, and the cry of woodseller joined the fishmonger and the knife grinder in the mornings. The North did what the North always does: built things that looked like endurance. A chain of watchfires rose across the old gift and the new one, whether there were volunteers for them or not. A young smith who had never shaped a horseshoe worth calling a horseshoe turned out iron braziers, whose mouths were large enough for a child to stand in. And someone laughed and said they looked like hungry crowns. White H. Arbor sent whalers to Skagos not to hunt but to buy glass from the bitter mines, and the traders returned with carts of obsidian wrapped in sheepskins and stories about goats that tried to bite the cold and broke their teeth. Children learned to run nets not only for fish but for embers that flew on the wind and tried to start fires where they were not wanted. And grown men listened to those children because ember nets became more valuable than swords. They started hearing the wolves. Not every night and not every place, but sometimes the long, low sound that is old as the cold slid down from the high flats in a way that made dogs flatten to floorboards. The wolves of the South were smaller and mistrusted this sound, but in the North it worked like another kind of message that people learned to read as best they could. One farmer said it was like listening to a king's letter read by someone who loved him but did not agree with him. Another said it meant, just this once, to keep your sheep in and your children out. More than one old man said his grandson was named after a wolf, and now he would have to take responsibility for that name. The first direct contact that did not end in screaming arrived wrapped in fur and oilskin so thick that the young runner who delivered it to Winterfell had to sleep in the stable for a day. Inside was a bone, polished so it looked like ice, and a spray of pine needles so fresh they stung. The bone was carved with marks that were not letters but were the shape of thought. The maester said the sequence meant something like, there are lines here, do not cross in body or thought, but if you must, bring nothing that still remembers warmth. A woman from north of the land where names ever mattered said it meant more simply, he does not want you to die in his country. They placed the bone above the new map room's door, and sometimes men looked at it before they argued. That is when the talk became covenant. A ranger with hair gone white at the temples from a winter spent sleeping on stone told the queen in the north in a voice that barely rose from a whisper that he had seen a field of hands lift in unison to halt a stampede of dead. He said those hands were moving because that was how the cold moves things, but he was wrong. The dead didn't stop the living. The living stopped themselves because the figure at the head of the dead lifted one hand, and the force of habit was so strong that even in winter it worked. He said he would know that hand anywhere. Someone else asked why there were no reports of slaughter if the dead were moving, and he said softly that he did not know, and that not knowing felt like a debt. It is true that not all crossings went without blood. An ambitious man from the Rills believed no border should defer to winter and took 30 men north to chop down a stand of trees that he said were his by right. The men did not return, and in the night the dead carried their bodies back to the edge of the line drawn with frost and set them there with their hands folded on their chests, as if teaching their families how to lay them down properly. The wives and sisters came with burning torches and were allowed to pass through the ranks of the silent to collect their own. And the sisters cried into their palms because the dead had not touched them. Afterward there were fewer ambitious men with axes and more fires tended by hands that shook. A boy who had once been given a stale heel of bread by the Lord Commander of a dying order found himself standing on a ridge of blue snow and looking down at what he was sure was that man, only colder and stiller and hurt by something he had chosen, while a wolf that looked like prayer stood beside him with eyes that did not blink. The boy grew older in a breath and turned around and walked as quickly as he could without running, because there are lines in a human map that once crossed cannot be crossed back without losing something you will need later. He told anyone who would listen that he had seen those eyes and that they still remembered faces. The 6 kingdoms learned how to keep the 2 measures of time that would rule the next years, which were hunger and distance. The distance to the border mattered because it told you how much wood to cut and how many candles to save. The hunger was the blunt wish to be warm, and it made allies where there had been enemies and enemies where there had been polite agreements. The faith decreed the dead must be burned with words about returning the spark to the great fire, and the Red Temple nodded as if they had invented the practice, and in truth they had. And the North said nothing because it had long practiced practical measures and did not care who took credit if the children breathed. Salt became an inscription in the way people grew up. Young women left strings of salt on windowsills to keep the world apart, and young men pretended they did not understand why because they wanted to be asked, and children sneaked a taste of it and were scolded not for the theft but for the fact that salt could save a life if it was needed later. Traders adapted. In Old Town, a craftsman began making iron kettles thin as a coin with lids that fit like secrets, used for carrying coals on horseback. The first shipment he sent north was dismissed by the quartermaster at Moat Cailin as Southern finery, and then a storm took 8 men in a single night because they had no fire but what they could carry. After that, the kettles went as quickly as they could be made, and the craftsmen hired women whose husbands had died to hammer lids, and Old Town began to feel the northern cold through a sound. The ring of 10,000 thin lids setting down on 10,000 kettles every night. In the Vale, a lord with a taste for engineering and revenge on anything that thought itself inevitable built stone houses roofed with slate over the communal burning grounds so that the snow could not foil the last kind. Ness, and no one laughed at what had been named the smoke houses. On the Iron Islands, a proud people who believed the sea took its own dead found a way to hold their convictions up to the winter and lost. They began to bind the bodies of drowning men with tarred rope and set them alight in their boats as the tide pulled out, saying their words to the drowned god while the fires stained the water like wine. It was the first time in centuries the islands smelled like cedar instead of salt. From time to time, something like appeal went north. Not words on parchment. Speech freezes too easily and brittle things do not travel far in winter. But people brought to the border the things they could not solve. A child who stopped speaking after her mother died. A fever that turned a boy's skin to candle wax. A rumor that a band of thieves had made a camp in a cave where bears once slept and were taking women who brought goats for trade. They left the child and the fever and the rumor with a stack of dry wood and walked away. Not everything was answered, but there were nights when the thieves would stumble out of a cave without their knives and lie shivering until a fire took pity on them. And in the morning the women would reclaim their goats. There were mornings when the fever would break like glass and the boy would cry for bread, and an old woman would touch his cheek and say the wind had laws again. It took longer for the South to understand that what had been nightly terror had changed into governance. The dead do not forget instructions. That was the first lesson. If they had been told to stand in a ring around a village and before they meant to do harm, now they stood in a ring around a village so that harm could not enter. If they had been told to carry spears, they now carried them not as a promise but as a tool with an edge, and more than one spear was used to ring the gap of an ice vault so a child would not crawl in. It did not make them gentle, only obedient, and it did not make their king a healer, only a man with rules. He moved like someone who knew his work and allowed no one to speak to him about how he felt about it. The old languages had no word for truce with winter. The North found one. It sounded like a blessing and a rasp at once and was used at the ash line, the new border named for what was left when the burnings were done. A line of pale dust that looked like it had always meant to be there. Women in pelt cloaks brought sacks of bones of their own dead to the line, and the dead fanned out like silent bird wings to make room. And the living said that word and stepped back, and the dead moved forward and took the bones into the land that knew what to do with them. There were men of the faith who began to sputter when they saw this, and there were men of the faith who began to weep. When the Red Temple heard the word, they repeated it with rough accents, because anything that kept the fire from burning too many of the living pleased them, even if the rules did not. When the small council convened and the reports were tallied, the tallies themselves were strange. Fewer raids on winter caravans. Fewer disappearances along the White Knife. A reduction in wolf attacks in the Western Hills because wolves now had somewhere else to be led by something older than a whistle. And another line of numbers that held itself unervingly steady. People dying of cold in their houses despite the improvement in kettles and braziers. Starving despite the caravans. Taking their ships out when the weather had the mutter of something that would push them under, because hunger is a god whose temple is the belly and it takes whatever is offered. The hand told the king that all triumphs in the snow must be measured against this and watched servants build a fire with a skill that had returned like a lost craft. There were nights when the king closed his eyes and saw the north as birds do. It is not recorded what he saw beyond the shape of white pushing down and then stopping as if a hand pressed against it. Men who sat at the small council table with him said that he held a quill and did not write and then put it down and said the words "there is a line," and the words did not sound like a wish but like memory. Those men kept their counsel because the throne had taught them that when a king who knows where the rivers will split says there is a line, he is not drawing one. He is reading, A zealot who styled himself a champion of warmth took 50 men up from the Bar Rolands with dragonglass in their packs and a priest at their head, believing a war against the dead is the only pure war. They went past the ash line under banners sewn from red cloth that had never been warmed by sun and set fires as they marched because they were afraid of the dark. The dead made no move to stop them until they reached a weirwood that had grown in a way that made men uneasy, as if it were listening. Then the dead stepped into their path and did not move. The dragonglass knives stayed where they were because there is something about pulling a knife on a silent man in the snow that breaks the wrist. The zealot spat a prayer and ran forward and was not struck. He ran through the ring of the dead and kept running because the cold beyond that ring is not a place where prayer follows easily. Later men would find him in a bind of fallen pines with his lips blue and his chest full of air too cold to use. The priest wrapped him in his own cloak and dragged him south. It was a long drag. He lived, and when he could speak again he did not. Lords made calculations. If the dead could be told to guard, then perhaps they could be told to fight the living enemies who had done so much harm. The North was unconvinced. There were border lords who had not eaten meat in a week who spoke in admiration about the idea of a king who did not stir for human wars. It was like being told that the sea would not rise for any one man's pride. In the Riverlands, old grudges stuck out their heads like snakes when the ground warmed and were cut down by the law because the law had learned to be quick. In Dorne, where stories about winter are told because they are interesting rather than because they conduct daily life, people use the phrase "he wears frost" to mean someone who took a burden no one asked for and did not put it down, and parents said it to children to remind them that a day's work had to be done even when it was uncomfortable. There was one winter that bit harder than the rest. The ash line blew south until it dusted the barley in white, and the snow closed a hand over the stone of Moat Cailin and did not open. The secrets, those narrow tracks known only to men whose lives were longer than winters, froze. The queen in the north did not ask. She sent riders to the south, and they returned leading a long train of horses laden with grain from the reach because the man who was paid to think of wheat had thought of wheat in time. The south did not deliver out of love. It delivered because hunger is a knife that cuts men at their tables as neatly as men in their fields. Wagons rolled through the neck along paths that had been built in a softer year by men who remembered that soft years are the place to do hard work. The trains were watched, not by birds or bandits, but by a low procession on the far side of the ash line that matched their pace, and the men who walked beside the grain looked sidewise at those pale ranks and kept walking because they had too much to carry to take fright. You cannot keep a world at bay without it taking revenge. In the 4th year of the New Order, a sickness touched the ports and climbed inland with the speed of gossip. Old men whose lungs had seen too many winters began to cough in the afternoons, and children woke with the taste of iron. There is no law that commands disease to stop at a line, but there are kings who think in terms of lines. The border of the north grew still for 3 days. Men from Widow's Watch swore they saw fog crawl like an animal and lie down paws first along the ash line, and during those days there were fewer funerals. It was not healing. It was more like a grip placed on a scarf to keep it from unraveling. The dead do not die. That is their one advantage, and the living used it by accident. A woman from a village no one thought would survive the winter wrote to her sister by carving a message into a board and sending it south with a passing trader. She said she had stood in the new cairnyard with her father on a day when the cold looked like a low tide and listened to the sound of bones settling under frost. She said 2 flocks of crows circled overhead and pointed north, and that the wolves spoke for a long time and then stopped. She said, though she would not say it to her husband, that when she thought of the man who now ruled the other side of the ash line, she thought of stew that had gone cold but not spoiled, and she did not know what lesson to draw from that. The board never reached the sister. It was burned as part of a bread oven. The trader remembered the sound of the woman's voice anyway. Those who had known him in the days when warmth was just a word found work for themselves. A wildling leader with a scar that looked like a map across his cheek served as a kind of interpreter, if interpretation is understood to mean the act of telling people when not to do something they will regret. He went north and returned less often as the years went by, and when he returned his campfire jokes were colder and his hands trembled. But he was alive, and he said the same thing each time he was asked. He is not hunting you. He said it the way a winter father says go chop wood. It is not going to cut itself. A woman who had once put a knife in the most dangerous place and lived made winter journeys whether anyone commanded her to or not, and she did not say what she saw because some debts are not paid aloud. Sometimes children would sit by the gates at Winterfell to look at her saddlebags in case a small thing had been tucked there, a token. Once there was a rune carved in ice that did not melt though the bag was warm. It did not mean anything anyone could read, and still she placed it in the palm of the queen in the north, and both women looked at it and then away. Old rivalries bent into new shapes. The Vale sent men who were good with rope and men who were good with ledgers, because the Ashline needed bridges as much as it needed oaths, and someone had to build the roofs over the burning grounds and someone had to count the soot. The Iron Bank learned how to price cremation and offered loans to villages short of wood. And a boy who took such a loan laughed after he signed his name and said his living had never been worth 20 gold pieces before. Down in the Reach, a bright lordling who liked projects tried to breed a hardy strain of willow that would grow fast and straight for nothing but burning. In the Riverlands, men who had learned to fear fire in war now learned to love it in peace and told jokes about it the way people do when they are teaching themselves to be unafraid. There were fights in taverns between men who thought the dead should be given iron collars and men who thought collars were pointless when obedience is already assured, and someone always lost teeth and then apologized to fire because that was the god who had to listen to the argument. From Essos there came stories like birds blown off course. A sailor from Bravos swore he had seen a ship trapped in a sudden sheet of ice that rolled in the dawn like gold leaf, but that the ice cracked open before noon with the sigh of a lung and set the ship free. In the markets of Pentos, a particular kind of knife with a blade duller than it looked sold for twice its previous price and drew men who did not care to ask where the stone had been dug. Singers added a verse to an old song about the woman with unbound hair who had flown on a beast that breathed light. And in this verse a man walked behind her on foot, counting, and taking the things she dropped because he could not bear to leave them. The verse was liked in places where people enjoyed accounting. In the ports, a new curse developed. By the man made of hoarfrost, meaning may you be stuck doing what you did not choose until you have dignity about it. What could not be curbed found a different outlet. The warlike learned to play at war with ash tournaments. Men fought with no blade and only ash sticks that left gray smudges on cheeks and armors, and won by making shapes on their opponent, and the shapes meant words. It spread until in White Harbor those ugly sticks with smudged ends were stacked in the corner of every alehouse, and people used them in the way they used cards when they wanted to pretend their fate was in their hands for a moment. Less theatrically, the watch returned in the form of men and women who tended the border fires and who swore to no bed and no blood and very little glory. They took in orphans who had learned to love heat too deeply and taught them measured tending. They took in old men who had been dismissed as done and asked them to sit and watch the flame because that was a skill too. Their vows did not mention celibacy because life had made other demands of them. Their oaths spoke plainly, "We will keep the line visible." Not all men could accept a world that had chosen another kind of peace. A river lord who had lost too much in the previous wars gathered a company of men with long knives and longer reasons and hired a boat to take them into the teeth where the rivers gnash. His plan, if it can be called a plan, was to traverse the high lakes, cross over where ice mended the gaps, and come down from behind the white procession like a hunter taking a stag. It ended with him frozen into the lake itself with his men, the boat locked fast like a bug in sap. In the spring, people chipped his body out and burnt it while a priest said words that did not mention stags or vengeance. They used the boat for a bridge across a shallow and then burned the boat too when a woman said she did not want her children to see it every day and learn the wrong lesson. South of the neck, there were couples who married with a new phrase added to the old promises. If winter comes again like a hand around the throat, we will move together. They lit 2 fires and faced north and then turned to each other. Some wore pendants of blue glass, which in the first years were meant to mock and then were meant to honor, and by the 5th year were meant only to say, I do not know what to call what I feel about it, but I want to admit it is there. There were babies named for frosts and for animals with white fur. There were babies named for fire and for the wood it fed on and for the woman who ran the wood yard without cheating on the measure. Songs settled and stopped changing so much. People grew used to waking at midnight and hearing that long, slow voice pour down from the north like barrel staves rolling downhill, and the next morning their bread was better because the oven had been respected in the night. Men say that in the far, far north, beyond the reaches where men have ever been, there had always been other things. spiders with bellies like the moon in the last quarter, worms that live in the snow and come up to taste the skin of reindeer, hounds that run on paws that scissor the air. These things began to die out or go away, nobody could tell. Hunters smelled fewer strange smells. The children of the forest, if they existed and if they cared, sent no messages that anyone understood, unless the extra ring growth in certain heart trees counted as a message. A woman with green eyes from near the wall's ruins said she had once put her palm on a smooth place of bark and felt a heartbeat that did not belong to her. She said it felt calm. She did not say she cried because she knew people who had felt other heartbeats in trees once and not survived the knowing. There was a rumor about a girl who had walked to the line for years with a basket of bones, hoping that if she just kept coming she would be given back the one she most wanted. On a very clear morning, the dead parted for her, and a tall figure that was not dead and not alive brought her a length of bone smoothed to a new color with use. And when she held that bone in her hands, she knew it was not her lover's and not her father's and not herself returned in a circle but something else. And she went south after that and married a kind man and had 7 children and never once went near the ash again. People told that story in different ways. That she wept, that she laughed, that she threw the bone back across the line and was struck down for her insolence, that she kissed the figure's hand and the figure shied away like a horse. None of the tellings mention the wolf because in that story the wolf is always a presence you do not notice until the end. On a spring day that did not warm as quickly as it meant to, the queen in the north went to the border with only 3 companions and looked out at the blue that is the color beset by white. She had not begged for this. No one had. She brought with her a folded cloak lined with fur so dark it drank the light. No song records whether the figure she came to see came near. All anyone remembers is that the wolf walked within a stone's throw, much closer than the dead, and lay down as if he trusted everyone with something precious. The queen said words later that she did not share with anyone but her gods, and ever afterward the stories of their house included a line that said queens wear the winter when they have to. It was more of a proverb than a vow. A boy who listened to the story for the first time asked how she had known whether the figure could hear her if he stayed far away. His mother told him that if the figure had not wanted to hear, he would not have been there at all. The borders of men are not the only borders. There is a point past which grief becomes architecture. The North learned to live in houses built out of the shape of what it had lost. That meant the triangulated braziers and the kettles and the chimneys fitted with iron mouths. It meant the stone houses built around fire rings so that hot air could be braided through sleeping rooms. It meant the line itself, patrolled not by men who beat their chests but by men who made a professional study of coals. There were festivals in the summer when the ground softened and men ran races in the slush, and then soaked their feet in buckets of warm water and told the children about winters that would not return like this and meant it. On those days mothers held children up to touch the warm ash in the braziers, and the little ones smeared it on their cheeks and said they were kings of smoke. Sometimes no one corrected them because the words had never been made for this and language was catching up. From time to time a man would ask what happens when the king of winter grows tired. He said it as a challenge or as a prayer or as a drunk's dramatic line to keep a table's attention. The answers were many and all of them unsatisfying. The most common was that tiredness is for men who may put their tools down at night. The dead have no such habit. A quieter answer was that the thing that had happened to him was not like an inheritance that can be handed back. It was more like making yourself into a place. A place doesn't get tired or it ceases to be a place and becomes a ruin. In taverns this sounded too much like philosophy, so men would ask if he slept and if he ate and if he loved and if he remembered. A woman from Bear Island said that he remembered in the way that lace remembers the shape of the hand that made it. She said it with her jaw tight and her eyes somewhere else, and no one asked her to explain because it was impolite to ask a woman from Bear Island anything twice. War returned to the South enough to remind people how much they disliked it. A lord with a claim on a phrase and another with a claim on a field made a wreck of each other's banners. Men died with curses for warm enemies on their tongues. And in the night after the fighting a wind came down that made glass ring in windows and bones twitch where they lay unburned. Panic followed and then a lesson that should have been learned already. Even now, especially now, the dead must be burned with care. It did not become a legend because there is no glamour left in learning a thing you should have known, but it became the reason that men in armor now traveled with wagons that held nothing but wood and oil, and boys made jokes about their mothers telling them to take a cloak and their quartermasters telling them to take a pyre. One summer was bright enough to fool a whole generation of children into thinking the old stories were lies. They ran barefoot across fields with the ash line, just a suggestion on the horizon, and when told to come in they became as indignant as all children do. A man from the south who had fled to the north years before stood at the line in that summer and felt the way the air there refused to be lulled. He went home and told his neighbors to keep their kettles and their vows, and they said there is time, and he said do not insult time. He did not become popular, but when winter came back on soft feet that moved fast, his neighbors had more wood than most. In that same season, the dead remained where they had been told to remain, and because the light was good and the day was long, people let themselves look. They saw lines like a page's ruling. They saw a kind of order that was not kindness. If you walk the ash line now and place your hand on the old post at Lord Harroway's ghost field, you will feel initials carved into it by men who stood watch. They used knives to write names that no longer know who they are attached to. They used nails when knives were too valuable. There is a set of letters higher than the rest that someone had to stand on another's shoulders to cut. It is a set that was once used to sign orders in Winterfell. People who can read and people who can only see that they are looking at letters stare at that mark and do not speak for a moment. They do not know whether it was cut by his friend or his enemy or his sister or his squire or a farmer who liked the shape. It is better that they do not know. A world built of certainty would be colder than the one they have. No one wrote down the hour when he took the crown that no man had made, because no one saw a crown. They saw only weather take a shape and then keep it. Some say the moon had a ring like the inside of a cup on that night. Some say a cloud went too low and stopped. Some say the wolves went silent and then howled not for fear but for recognition, long and long. The living continue to tell the story, and the story continues to adjust itself to the size of the room it needs to fit. A ranger swears there was a sound like a door closing very gently. A woman sewing a shirt for her eldest says she would prefer no sounds in this story at all. A priest says a word about sacrifice that makes half his congregation angry and the other half weep. A king hears the reports and sets down his quill and opens his hand and says a line has been drawn where a line must be. If you want a moral, the men at the tavern will provide you with one for the price of a drink. They will say that a man who did not want a throne learned that all thrones are chairs pushed under a weight. They will say that mercy done at the right hour does not need a song. They will say that a world without monsters is a world where men have to learn each other's weaknesses in detail, and who wants that? If you want an ending, the women in the smoke houses will tell you there are no endings, only fires to bank and coals to carry and children to K. Eep from backing into the hearth. There are years when those fires feel like faith and years when they feel like a swear. The line continues regardless, drawn in ash and in understanding. There are nights when a white shape stands on a far ridge and the moon makes a crown in the air above it whether the moon intends to or not. On those nights, men who have kept fire for too long walk out with their hands full of a heat that hurts and look north until their eyes water. They go back to their posts and put their hands over their kettles to warm them back to usefulness. They tell the new boy on duty to mind the sparks that lift in the hour before dawn. He nods and thinks of all the stories he has been fed and decides which ones he will lay aside. By the third hour, the wolf's call has ebbed away and the birds begin. The boy does not know this yet, but what he has been hearing is not war and not peace and not a king's command. It is the sound of a border that is both a wound and a scar, managed by someone who shoulders the burden because no one else can lift it. A letter comes south one winter that is colder than the rest, written by a woman no one expects to write letters. She had once walked out into a courtyard with a sword in her hand and a coat that did not fit and made oaths with bruised lips, and now she writes in a neat hand that the fires are holding, that the river has not frozen solid, that a bear visited the town green and did no harm, that children are beginning to play at border watch the way earlier children played at nights, and that she has decided to be pleased by this because invented games are how people heal. Near the end of the letter, she writes a single sentence that does not advance any argument. He is there, she writes, and then puts a dot after it that is absolute. In White Harbor, a ship is launched that was built of woods meant not to crack in cold and hides strapped so tight they squeal. The men who will sail her do so in summer when the line is a suggestion. They go to the Skagos mines and load obsidian in blocks, and men who have never liked numbers calculate loads and ballast because they have learned that if you do not like numbers you will like burial in winter even less. The ship is named not for winter but for the ash that marks where the living have chosen to stand. The first mate, who cannot read his own name, has memorized a sentence from a speech he heard once in a hall too grand for him. He says to the shipwright before they cast off that they are not defying winter. They are obeying it in a way that keeps the children's feet warm. Neither man tells the other that he does not fully understand what he has said. There is a lonely kindness in the far north that no one remarks on because remarking on it would make it smaller. Sometimes the dead carry away not bones but the wreckage of the winter itself. The trees that broke under ice and the stones that slipped from ridges like teeth knocked out and the snarls of moon spider silk that wind has tied. The land that used to ignore itself wakes under this attention as if surprised to be noticed. The living watch with the mixed feeling that is the mundane cousin of awe and continue to keep their own side of the covenant. Salt left where salt must be left, ashes swept where ashes must be swept, lines drawn by hands that are sometimes cold and sometimes shaking but always mindful. The dead take and the living let them, and that exchange keeps larger things from moving into the space between. Years pass the way they do when nothing flashy is happening and everything important is. Children born after the war and after the coronation that was not a coronation reach for words that fit what they have always known. They do not say the old word with fear in it. They are as irreverent as all children must be, and they joke when they should not and write songs when they should be sleeping and sneak into smoke houses to dare the heat. And then they grow up and take the ember pans from old men with careful hands and say sleep now, and for a few years they think they learned the trade in a week until a storm demonstrates that they did not. They fall in love and put their hands together over low fires and learn the way a face looks good by firelight. They bury their dead, and all the while the line holds because that is what it was made to do. A last letter from a man with hair gone to white arrives at a stead on the Bar Rollins. The boy who receives it thinks the letter will be about money and wood, and it is, and also not. The old man asks him to remember that nothing they have done was done because it was glorious. It was done because it was necessary, and because necessary things become dignified only after some years of practice. He writes that if he could meet the man who bears the cold crown, he would say one thing and one only. Do you want me to send you news of the lambing? The boy who reads the letter does not understand at first, and then he puts his hand out toward the cook fire as if shaking hands, and the fire does what it has always done and meets him halfway. On the far ridges where the ice makes the air ragged, the figure continues to pace in accordance with laws no one made. The wolf's breath still does not smoke. The dead do as they are told. Snow balances on branches that could not carry it before and does not fall. In the south, a king listens to counsel and keeps his hands open. In the north, a queen wears a cloak that breaks the light and walks out in cold that does not bend for anyone and returns with cheeks that sting. Sheep's commune. Children steal salt. Lovers warm each other patiently. The line holds. It remains a sentence written across a page that is the world. And the hand that writes it has not finished and will not finish because the joy of that sentence is not in its end but in the fact of its being written at all. The second winter notices valued quiet over spectacle. A keeper of lanterns at Deepwood, Mott added a line to her weather shelf that the northern lights now braided themselves with a steadiness she had not seen as a girl, and an apprentice scribe in Barrowton made a private mark whenever the hush at dawn arrived early. Boat ledgers along the White Knife recorded that fog paused at the ash line as if undecided and then curled back into itself. Roof slates laid in the year when wolves learned to speak again hummed when the wind rose from the flats, and old men whose hearing had turned to a soft blur said they knew the difference between that hum and the ordinary hiss of winter, and their sons listened. The money mistake was not made twice. Merchants who had sold oil with pitying smiles now set up booths painted with black suns and offered contracts writ in plainer language than the old guilds had ever used. The terms were cold too. So many cords of pine and oak per village, with interest counted not in months but in deep nights. A phrase borrowed from a ranger's journal because numbers carry better when they sound like the weather. A woman in Gulltown built a fortune on selling iron chisels that would not shatter in frost and sent a portion north with the explicit instruction to give them to widows first. No one had taught her to love the north. The ledger had done it for her, showing that when widows work, villages pay on time. There were men who could not bear the word covenant and called it surrender by degrees. They met in secret chambers under banners stitched with gold suns and thought themselves brave. A watcher at the beacon in the rills wrote that one of these men, a stout lord with soft hands, rode north with a cart of dragonglass hidden under sacks of rye, intending to cross quietly and set the dead alight from within, as if the dead were a herrick. He returned with his hair dusted white as flour and his cart stacked with his own empty sacks. The watchers took his name from their ledgers because the real punishment was that no one would lend him wood now. In taverns, the story was told with a kindness that did not save his pride. The dead had taken the grain and left him alive because the North would need that rye more than it needed another man's lesson. Songs worked at the border the way old habits do in houses. Not sung aloud where the air might freeze the sound into shards, but hummed low in the throat when tending fires and combing ash. A girl with a pot-scored hand invented a tune no one could teach her not to hum. It turned up everywhere in a season, in the rice mills of Old Town, in the counting houses of bravos, in the kitchens of the Red Keep where men boiled broth in cauldrons big enough to hide a boy. The words adapted themselves to the work being done at hand and were not written down because the memory that was needed was in bodies, not books. In the North, that same tune picked up a slow bar added by a man who sat alone by the ash line and counted breaths when the cold fought his lungs for them. The small council permitted a new badge that was not a sigil so much as a courtesy. A blue thread woven through the edge of a cloak for those who tended the border fires. In the South, young men began to wear a single thread in imitation, and young women laughed at them kindly when they fumbled with the needle. There was a pattern to the way the South absorbed a Northern practice, and in this case the pattern was genuinely useful. Every border burning ground now had a long bench with 3 needles tied to it and a jar of threads, so that anyone who mended a watchman's torn hem would be thanked by name the next morning. Hospitality became a trade again. A memorandum from a careful woman in Lannisport traced how the dead adjusted the paths along the barrows without footfalls. She wrote that drifted snow acquired edges as if trimmed by a blade, and that frozen rivers lifted themselves into low walls that turned cattle aside without panic. Men in cities where winter is a news story, not a life, accused her of superstition from their desks. A year later, a flood broke out along the Green Fork in a thaw that came like a knife blade through rope. And in that moment, it did not matter whether city men believed her report. The dead moved where they had been told to move, placing their weight where water must be asked to go. Men with carts and women with bundles stood on earthen banks and watched water that might have gotten into their throats write a new sentence between themselves and a drowned spring. The gods received thanksgiving from lips that had not been used for such words in years, and the men who had accused superstition rewrote their ledgers under new headings that were not about piety at all but about what it costs to drag a drenched field back into use. When animals move differently, law learns to run to catch up. The wolves stopped taking sheep from the eastern slopes as often because they began to travel with a patience taught by the slow march of the dead. This was not benevolence. It was instruction. Men who had never understood the animal charter of the North found that their lambing season survived where it used to be ruined and wrote stiff letters to Winterfell about the excellent moral character of certain packs. The answers they received were brief and left no hand to be thanked. Keep your dogs home at dusk. Tend the fires near the flocks. Lay salt where you've always been told. There is a kind of benevolence that refuses ceremonies because ceremonies collapse in the cold. Of all the civilian offices that winter brought back, the carter of ash was the strangest. A man in the West made his living by traveling between villages and smoke houses, taking ash in barrels to scatter it where the ground must be reminded of its duty. He learned in a season what the old crone who taught him had learned in a lifetime: that ash keeps snow honest, that it marks a border so a child will not blunder, that it says to the dead and the living, "In alike we agree where this ends." He grew fond of certain villages and their children, and he began to leave small gifts. A bright stone from the river, a mended toy. One of the children collected these tokens and kept them in a box. Long after, when she was an old woman, she opened that box and took out a round of blue glass and found a tiny nick at its edge. She rubbed her thumb over the nick until the skin warmed it and knew a better word for gratitude than thank you. The temple fires in the South debated themselves into exhaustion. The faith declared that cooperation with the cold was a sin of despair, and the Red Temple replied that despair was a failure of heat, not of doctrine. A little shrine to the drowned god did the practical thing and installed a stone platform with iron rings beside its door so families could secure wrapped bodies through the worst wind. A priest from the Golden Capital came north to confront the queen in the north with a speech stacked with hard-angled words like outrage and fidelity, and left with a shorter speech about duty. Later he told his own flock that he had been heard, and people who trusted him allowed that perhaps his words had happened to the right person with the wrong tone. It did not change the law. Bodies were still consigned to fire within a day, and the necessity had grown so ordinary no one thought to fight it except men who liked fighting. News went east and returned with a different accent. In Bravos, merchant princes began to attend lectures on winter geometry, given by a woman who had been a steward in Old Town and now drew maps with ash and chalk on a table for money. She explained to men who had never felt a real frost that the line between alive and not alive was not lawless if a certain man held it, and that the line on the ground was not the same as the line in men's obligations, and that the cheapest assistance was salt when it was placed right. She grew rich in a quiet way and sent barrels of salt to the sisters in payment for the timber they shipped to White Harbor. The sisters smiled and wrote down the balance in an ink that did not run in damp salt air. An argument no one wanted became unavoidable when a company of soldiers in the Western Hills chased a band of slavers into a hamlet and found their way stopped by a silent ring of the dead. The captain of that company, a woman of the reach with scars and tidy rows like the stitches on a flag, had a decision to make between two wrong things: rush the dead and risk an old treaty, or allow the thieves to stand behind the dead like cowards and catch their breath. She made a third choice. She ordered a line of bonfires set up along the inside edge of the ash line and stood between those fires and the dead. The thieves did not like heat and liked the attention of children less, and the children in that village had been trained by games to throw handfuls of ash into guilty faces. The thieves ran the other way and were hunted down not by the dead, who stood where they had been told to stand, but by the villagers and the soldiers, who knew how to move in that weather and be kind afterward. The captain wrote a long report to the crown saying treaties are made for days like that, and the crown wrote back with 3 words: keep the line. Obsidian remained the strangest part of the economy. Miners on Skagos dug it with exhaustion and stubbornness and sent it south on ships wrapped like children in wool. The men who smuggled wine and women who smuggled lace learned to smuggle stone in daylight, because no one stopped a cart with that cargo anymore. A lordly boy in the Reach who loved new varieties of willow also loved numbers, and he studied how many stones were needed to arm how many men and concluded that numbers collapse where cold attends to itself. He did not say this in a hall. He wrote to a girl in White Harbor who loved maps and asked her to marry him. She laughed when she read it and married someone else who didn't talk so prettily about wood, but she kept the letter and read it to her children when they asked why knives no longer glittered so much in stories. A new school grew by accident at the line. There was no formal master, just a row of benches and a long table in a hut under the lee of a hummock where wind couldn't find purchase. Men and women with skill in iron and wood took turns teaching children to build ash sleds that would not tip and ember pans that wouldn't scorch a bear hide. A boy whose mother had died of a fever while the line held got very good at balancing the ember for a friend with frostbit hands, and when he grew up he became a kind of engineer. He never learned to write his name, but he taught 20 villages to breathe better in winter by arranging ducts and doors and the breaks between dreams. If you had called him a genius, he would have told you to save the word for whatever had allowed him to be a boy long enough to become a man. Wolf talk acquired grammar. Hunters who paid attention could tell the difference between a long call that meant new snow and a shorter one that meant ice made the ground treacherous. Someone wrote down these guesses in the margin of a ledger of wood deliveries, and someone else copied them onto a board in the market at Winterfell, and soon enough they were wrong as often as they were right in the way weather always manages to be. It did not matter. The presence of a pattern was the comfort, not its perfection. A woman who had once been good with a blade kept her knife for cobbler's work and started leaving meat at the base of a certain tree. She did not look up when she did it because ritual is better when it wears the coat of habit. She let someone else tell the stories now. She tended shoes. A second disease came, weaker than the first and unremarkable except for the way men spoke about it. In the south there was talk of port incidents and vector rates and guild insurance. In the north there was talk of the line staying ill, and it did. Men imagined that stillness as a kind of attention paid by a friend they had not wanted. 3 villages kept their elders a week longer than expected, and in that week they taught grandchildren the tricks of ovens and lamps. When those elders died, the children found that grief feels different when a skill is passing through you while it happens. They lit their own fires. Men did what men do in a lull. They fought among themselves about what had been achieved and who had the right to name it. The Queen in the north allowed a congress at the newly rebuilt hall at the Treasure Tree, and men who had lived in shadow for years entered the light with speech sharpened by practice done in private. A man from the Vale argued for a metal ring to be set into the ground the entire length of the border so the line could be seen even in storm. A woman from the mountain clans said storms have their own insight and should not be denied. A quiet old fellow from Last Hearth suggested that men who quarreled about a line they had not spent a night keeping might like to volunteer for a month. They did not, but they left more sheep on the hoof with the border watch when they went home than they had planned to, and that was a kind of answer too. South of the Neck, a movement with the dull name of Restoration attempted to persuade the king that winter had disarmed the crown. Their pamphlets were elegantly printed. They argued that a monarch who delegates to cold will soon find cold delegating to him. The pamphleteers used phrases that sounded like furniture and clothing and made people comfortable while they read them. The king, who had been a boy once in a time when winter meant a giant falling stone and a terrible choice, listened and then swiveled his gaze east and west and took counsel with the only people who had not come to his throne to be warmed by it. He took counsel with the keepers and the watchwomen and the old men with ash in their hair and decided against restoration because it was a kind of forgetting. A law was passed that read like bread. Plain, nourishing, easily broken for neighbors. It required every village that could spare 2 hands to spare one to the fires during deep nights. It did not say the word loyalty. It did not need to. Letters were sent to the Iron Islands with a suggestion that was not quite an insult. The suggestion was that a people who knew how to build boats in cold seas might now find it patriotic to build barges to carry wood. The islands did not respond on paper because paper is not how the islands talk. They sent a boatload of men who spoke in the measured sentences of those used to hauling in nets together. Those men built 3 barges in a season on the White Knife and named them with names that had nothing to do with drowned gods. The first man to walk across one with a barrow full of pine stopped halfway and looked down and realized he was moving forward on the memory of water. He quickened his step, because men have always been moved to speed by the feeling that they are walking on something sacred. A rumor grew teeth and learned to bite. It was said that the line would one day move of its own accord, and that when that day came the South would be asked to pay a tax to the North to keep it where it was. Sophisticated men laughed and then began to budget for it quietly, because a man who likes control will always call violent prudence modest. The North did not debate a tax. The North debated whether the line needed towers at certain points, because the new watch had elderly men who could not climb ladders anymore and deserved to look down on the world once before they died. The towers were built and were not handsome. They were the kind of structures that embarrass poets and reassure mothers, which is to say the right kind for their purpose. Once a group of boys from the Riverlands took their ash sticks and whacked each other by the border until old watchers scolded them for playing painting games where solemn work must be done. The boys sulked. The next morning the boys returned with baskets and went up and down the line collecting stray embers before the wind could find them, and did it so well everyone forgot to say thank you. Their fathers told the story later as a lesson about obedience and missed the right moral. The correct moral was that boys who have learned to love a place will police it better than men who have learned to talk about it. A scribe in Winterfell who had kept a record of wolf calls ran out of margins and, resented by no one, moved his work to a bigger book with blank pages that scared him. He understood slowly and painfully that his work was history, even if all he did was assign marks to knights and find patterns that mostly did not hold. He found that men and women came to his little table for reasons that had nothing to do with wolves. A mother wanted him to write down the day her daughter first held a coal scoop without dropping it. A small victory to be recorded in ink that would not run if the roof leaked. A boy who had lost a finger wanted him to write down the day his stump stopped aching. A drunk brought him a memory that might have been a lie, and he wrote it down anyway because even lies have weight in winter. He died with ink on his thumb and a page half filled and a smile that had nothing to do with pride. One of the old keeps near the coast found a way to turn smoke into politics without insulting smoke. They built a bell with a throat wide enough to drink entire gusts. and when fires burned, the bell took the heat inside itself inside. It became the sound of the law being kept. Men who used to draw swords to establish points now pointed at the bell and said the sound is different tonight, and were heard as if they had produced a document. The keep sent young men with ear for weather to other keeps to teach bells to listen, and a silly joke arose about whether bells or men were better at hearing when a storm shifted. It is a waste of breath to argue with a bell, and a waste of a winter evening to argue with a man who has come to teach you to live. So the joke died, and the bells remained. Foreigners came with knives disguised as gifts. A red priestess from across the sea presented a narrow chain made of some heat-carrying metal and claimed it could be laid along the ash line to turn the cold to steam in a day. The queen in the north smiled at her and asked whether she had ever seen a forest. The priestess claimed to have seen 1,000 under a golden sky, and the queen said that was a pity, implying no one should see 1,000 of anything if they wanted to understand it. The chain was tried on a length of ground less than the distance a child runs from a joke to his mother. Curled like a snake at noon, the dead did not move. Steam rose and drifted to no purpose. The chain did not break, and it did not succeed. The priestess learned that knights do not care for spectacles and went home to the work of teaching people to mind their own fires. A wedding in White Harbor introduced a new custom that embarrassed both families and then outlived them. The couple stood in front of a brazier and tossed in handkerchiefs embroidered with the names of grudges they had inherited. The names burned slowly and sent up a smoke that was barely smoke and smelled of nothing. The groom's uncle cried because the handkerchief with the name of his father's last enemy had cost him dear, and the bride's mother laughed because the handkerchief with the name of her own father had been badly embroidered by a cousin no one liked. The crowd clapped in the way a crowd claps when it is being introduced to something that will need practice. In the 4th year of the custom, a couple burned no handkerchiefs at all, and instead held hands in silence while a boy smudged their faces with ash. People who get bored at weddings said it was dull. People who had keepers in their families said it was right. A brief war south of the neck tried to insist that winter had made men soft. 2 border hamlets emptied themselves of men and women to tend to the wounded regardless of sigil, and then returned to their fires with their backs stiff from labor. The wounded, who had been raised to expect the dead or the living to claim them depending on allegiance, learned that the line between factions was less important than the line that divided cold from warmth. They went home and refused to fight so hard again, not because philosophy had taken root, but because their bodies had added up the work and decided against it. Swords were swung with less conviction afterward, and fewer of them were drawn, and nothing but winter was given the full arguments of men. The first attempt at an embassy failed because men insisted on chairs. A table and chairs were carried to the very edge of the ash and set down, and the dead moved up like frost at the foot of the table and stood as if they were furniture. The ambassador, a lordling with a talent for words that dried in the air, trembled. He had expected a black throne and a crown hammered from night. What he saw was a figure standing at ease and a wolf that regarded the chairs with lazy contempt. The lordling began to say something about parley and paused because he heard himself as if from far away, his schooling echoing where it had no walls. He instead reported that the dead keep to their side and asked if there were any matters pressing enough to endanger that bargain. The figure's hand moved in a way like weather when it favors a low branch with rhyme. The lordling wrote later that he could not describe the gesture without inventing religion. The embassy returned with the understanding that there would be no tents, no carpets laid in snow, no wheels rutted into half-frozen ground. When the South wished to speak, it would do so as men do who are tired, standing. There were personal notices that never made it into halls. A boy from the Strawfields wrote on a broken shard of a plate that his father had burned at the right hour and that now the hearth spoke softer than before, as if the house had been scolded and was behaving. A woman at Sisterton posted a line in the market that she had not heard a certain seagull all season and wondered whether birds could move their nests for fear. A veteran of the last war woke with ice in his beard one midnight and sat up, certain that he had been made to stand by a sound like a child rolling an apple across a table. He went out to the yard and found no child and no apple, and in the morning said to his wife that he had been told to build a windbreak for the lambs and did so without complaint. She patted his arm and made him soup. Love learned to sound like chores. One of the islands off the Stitch discovered that its old barrows could keep heat if tended properly and transformed them into sleeping houses. The poor of the island, who had been sleeping under overturned boats and called that tradition, moved into those houses with a shrug and then realized they had become the caretakers of the weirdest future. Travelers made the error of saying that the island had become civilized, and the islanders glared until the travelers learned to say instead that the island had become clever. Cleverness opens doors more gently than civilization and is less likely to hurt the pet cat. There was a day when the sky hardened into the kind of blue that makes men ambitious, and 3 young fools stepped past the ash as a dare. They were not turned to ice. They were not struck by lightning or swallowed by the ground. They walked 20 paces and then stopped because the taste of the air changed so quickly it made their throats prickle. The dead watched them like trees. The boys tossed coins up and caught them with shaking hands because they were boys and pretended to have control. They returned to their side. One of them spent the rest of his life making kettles with lids like secrets in. Dee never married. One of them married and had 9 children and told them never to cross a line without knowing what it was for. The third left with a caravan and was never heard from again, which is not immoral but is the way stories respect the statistics of travel. Spring fought itself one year and sent rain that rattled like thrown grain. Rivermen who knew the sound of grain listened and began to stack their belongings higher in their huts. The ash line ran like a wick, the burned ground sending up smoke that insisted on its own condition. And in that hour the dead shifted their stance as if bracing. Water that was meant to drown certain fields did not. It took different fields, some of them owned by men with no patience for those who pretend to make treaties with weather. Their petitions to the crown used words like injustice and corruption, and the crown answered with the drain of wheat and wood and oil they owed those same villages in the year past. Arithmetic did not comfort them the way it comforted the crown, but the numbers were honest, and that honesty was painful in a way that heals. A greedy season is one that keeps more of its snow than it deserves. The 5th winter after the line was set, snow tried to stay past its allotted days. Children who had known only measured winters looked at their mothers with new interest in the old stories. The dead did not advance. They stood as if the season had miscounted and would correct itself. The wolves sang more frequently and then stopped as if scolding turned to patience. Men cursed quieter at their ovens and then louder when the bread failed, and the ovens learned under better hands. The greedy season relented not to rage but to repetition. The next year came with the exactness of a book page being turned in a room of listeners. There was a talk that the keepers at the line began to give to the young, told first by a woman from a hill town who had taught herself to read by touching letters carved deep into wood with her fingers. She told them that winter had taught her a game that no child finds exciting until they play it twice. The game was called Draw the Line Again. You drew a line with ash. Then you waited an hour and drew it again. The rule was that you could not pick up the old ash to make the new line. The young looked offended by the pointlessness and then learned. In this way they learned about attention and they learned about devotion and they learned about humility, and then later, if they were lucky, they learned to love the game. Another zealot tried armed theory. He gathered men to go west and come down along the mountains and said that the dead were no more than clever ice and could be broken with fire brought in barrels. He was wrong in such a way that he lived. His men lit their fire and the barrels stank and the dead stood and the wolf walked around the fire pit once as if considering a pastry. The zealot realized he had lost all at once and expected to be struck. Nothing happened to him. He took his men and went home and never spoke a word about it. When old age found him, his grandchildren asked him for stories and he told them about years when the sea had been so calm men believed the gods slept. He did not mention ice. He had learned a better silence than boastfulness. History changed its own grammar. The first generation had spoken in curses and prayers. The second spoke in routines and prices. The third began to speak in proverbs. A woman in the Riverlands said wisely that a good fence is one that keeps your children closer than it keeps wolves. And a man in the Vale replied that no fence is good if you do not plan for falling snow. A boy from White Harbor disproved his teacher's lesson by setting his quadrant not to the stars but to the way cold breath plumes in the morning and got measurements that would never be useful for anything except knowing when bread will rise. He did not apologize when told it was a waste of brain. He reminded his teacher that finding useless things is how useful things get a place to stand. A letter written in a humming hall in King's Landing asked for maps with details men had previously thought beneath their dignity. Where the ash had drifted thickest, where the wolves crossed most often, where the small fires struggled and the bigger ones roared. The old steward at Winterfell sent those maps without sentiment. He had learned from a boy who went white in the beard that sentiment is the drummer you ignore if you mean to march. The maps went up on the walls of a council chamber where men who had never washed ash from their cuffs stood with cups of wine and made faces like chess players. A woman who had washed ash from her own cuffs looked up and said ah when she saw a certain bend in a certain hill. You had to know the feel of that hill in your knee to read that map properly. She was given a chair and a stipend and a title that made her smile into her cup. Birds adapted. Ravens began to choose roosts closer to ground fires than they had before, and a boy who fed them learned to tell their moods. He grew into a keeper of an aviary and refused to let anyone name him Master of Ravens because he said mastery is not what's needed to keep a flock. He taught his birds the new routes that avoided snow blindness and trained them to land on the angle of a brazier's lip without scorching their feet. A rumor said that one of the birds flew further than any had flown, north beyond the old broken stones, and perched for an hour on the shoulder of a figure with breath that did not steam. The boy did not confirm this rumor. He did not deny it. He lowered his head and made a sound in the back of his throat that meant either respect or grief or both. A traveler from Dorne came north with spices that were useless to a cold tongue and still managed to sell them. She taught a cook in the New Watch to grind peppers into ash cakes until they carried heat in a way that felt like a surprise bandit, pulling you to your feet rather than knocking you down. The cook wrote to her sister about the recipe in a letter that also included an account of a fox they had rescued with a paw caught in a trap and then scolded into stealing fewer hens. The letter was saved because the recipe proved itself through a winter when children refused all food except those cakes, and the adults pretended to be annoyed by their pickiness while shoveling cakes into their own mouths when no one watched. There was a night when Aurora came down so low it lit the dead from within, and men who had believed their peace was rational wept for reasons they could not describe. A girl from a hamlet with 3 roofs called them beautiful and then corrected herself, saying later to her grandmother that beautiful was for flowers and dresses, and this felt like a word no one had invented yet because no one had needed it. The grandmother told her to invent it. The girl grew up and never found a word but found a song with a note long enough to satisfy a man who had nothing in his house but a single chair and a strong back. He paid her for the song by fixing the latch on her door, and she paid him by singing to his cows while they calved. In the cemeteries of the South, where men who loved ceremony had insisted on graves even after the law demanded fire, saplings sprouted with a vigor that made rivalries seem small. There were arguments about whether the ash from the smoke houses had drifted that far of its own accord or whether someone had carried it in a jar with love in mind. The arguments ended when children started climbing those trees and falling out of them and breaking their arms and then laughing about it later. Trees trouble theology. That is what they are well for. A man who had spent his childhood in a snowbound tower grew up to be a poet who insisted he was a clerk. He wrote lines that moved like lists. Kettles, bells, salt pans, crows, ash wolf, hand. The lists carried with them a weight that poets confuse with elegance and keepers confuse with competence. He never read his lines in halls. He recited them to the line with his breath steaming until his beard froze, and one night his voice stopped at last. A boy who had been tasked with carrying coals for him poked at his arm, and then put another blanket on him, and then went to tell the watch that the poet had finally gotten his wish and turned himself into a bench. They burned him with the others, where he belonged. There is a saying now that you will hear in the dockside taverns of the Merman City, and in the fish markets of the capital, and in the quiet rooms deep in the rock of the Vale where men store the seeds of crops they love. It is said as a joke and as a prayer and as a schedule. It goes like this: if he walks, we walk. It does not mean submission. It means that people became good at moving when a man who did not want to move became a place they could account for. Mothers say it to children who are reluctant to get up from warm beds. Quartermasters say it to wheelwrights who grumble at dawn. Keepers say it to themselves when the coal scuttle feels like a mountain. The line gained its own writers, men and women who did not compose but recorded. They made calendars of frost melt and thaws and used words like expected to keep their hearts steady. They had a saying of their own, that the world belongs to those who choose tasks you cannot finish. When a new keeper arrived with city ideas and a taste for completion, the older ones smiled in the way patience smiles and handed him an ember pan. It was not insult. It was the world asking for more hands. Ships from the east came in lower in the water, weighted with stone and wool and a few ideas about furnaces that made southern maesters put their hands to their chins and nod. One sailor had a story he refused to sell for money, and so he told it in exchange for bowls of stew. He said there is a cliff in the far north that drops into a kind of darkness not found at sea. He said that on a clear night he saw a procession like ants moving across a ridge, and that at their head was the suggestion of a man who breathed silence. He did not say the word king. He did not need to. Men who had never been north of their own city sounded the syllables anyway and smiled a little at their own boldness. Then they went to bed and dreamed of counting, and woke refreshed. A woman became famous for refusing fame. She ran a wood yard near the neck with such relentless honesty that men accused her of witchcraft and then offered to marry her. She declined them all and took their money and wrote down every penny. In the spring she walked to the border with a bundle of kindling on her head and left it there with a note tucked under a stick that said simply, "This is a favor I do not plan to collect." There were men who shook their heads at the naivety of that note and men who understood that certain ledgers must be balanced in rooms no one enters. In the night, the dead made a wider circle to leave the bundle undisturbed, which is to say that someone on their side had understood the note as well as any man in the South. In a year when the stars stepped out of their lanes and wandered, a girl at the far edge of the shivering sea dreamed a different dream. She dreamed that the crown of cold fell from a head and became a circle in the snow, and in the circle there grew weeds that were not weeds at all but herbs used by midwives. She woke and told no one because dreams embarrass the practical. She instead took water from a certain spring and sprinkled it on her doorstep and later wrote to her cousin that the child had come fast and with more anger than fear, and that something like a wolf howled very far away in the exact moment the midwife tied off the cord. The cousin read the letter to a circle of women, and one of them laughed in the careful way that women laugh when they are sure the gods are minding their manners. An old watcher at E.A. Stwatch, who had lived long enough to see men decide that his profession had been useless until they needed it again, taught a class of children to build windbreaks in the shape of questions rather than walls. He explained that wind likes to answer if asked right and sulks if fenced out. The children rolled their eyes and then built the questions and found that the wind answered with less rage. They told their fathers. The fathers took credit. The old watcher kept teaching because nothing would stop him now except the only thing that stops old men who have learned to love their work. And when it came, the burn ground accepted him with the same civility it had given hundreds before him. You could travel the line and fill a book with the new professions that winter assembled out of old ones and good hands. There was the orestone polishers, smoothing obsidian not for knives now but for mirrors used by midwives to catch the first light. There were the ember accountants, who tallied the way a village used its coal and suggested changes in the tone of a family friend. There were the bell glaziers, who learned to blow glass in ways that guarded the tongues of listening bells from the spite of sleep. There were the kettle reed cutters, who learned which marshes grew reeds that made the right sort of lid binding. And there were the children, employed by no one but every person in sight, their feet making maps in packed snow and their voices playing at border watch until they were old enough to take up the duty without play and found that the difference was smaller than they had been told. Nobody can say the precise year when the line became a folkway rather than a policy. It is like trying to name the day a child becomes a woman or a field becomes a farm. Men in cities would like to fix such moments with laws. The North countenanced the desire and continued to behave as if only practice mattered. Practice did not write books. It wrote the shape of men's lives. It wrote the timbre of women's voices when they scolded children near hot stoves and the way boys looked up when wolves sang. It wrote the courtesy with which a guard at a city gate inspected a cart of wood without making the driver feel like a thief. It wrote the sigh of a bell when the fire caught at dawn. It wrote letters from sons to fathers whose language was all about weather and tenderness. Now and then in the far distance men saw the figure where the cold is a wall you can lean on. It stood as it had stood for years, and the wolf lay sometimes as if bored and sometimes as if guarding a dream. Some men resented the comfort they took from this constancy. They wanted a revolution to be tidy and finite. Some men were grateful every morning of their lives and said their prayers not to gods but to diligence. Some children thought this was how the world had always been and could not be convinced otherwise by uncles with too many stories. They sang their ash songs and played their painting games and made embarrassing vows about growing up to be keepers and were not mocked out of it because adults had learned, finally, the difference between a child's bravado and a child's pledge. At the line there remains the bench where a poet froze and the post where a queen rested her hand and the ring of stones that marks where an embassy tried to insist on chairs. If you go there in lonely weather, a bell will bring its sound to meet you halfway. You may find a carter's broken axle bone tucked in a tuft of grass. You may find a coin that crossed and returned and sank into ash. You may find the mark of a wolf's paw and not know if it is new or 10 years old because wolves have always been careless about the way they date their documents. If you have lived well, you will find, even if you did not expect to, that your hands will start to heat themselves in the memory of a coal pan, and your breath will invent a tune you have not learned, and you will stand with your arms folded like a person listening to a friend who is working through a thought. That is the posture of the world now. It is the same in ports and on hills and beside small fires tended by big hands. It is the posture of those who understand that the work continues because the worker continues, and that there is a man at the line who does not sleep, and that this is not cruelty but covenant, and that covenant, properly kept, keeps a world from breaking. By a summer that does not apologize for itself, children born in the first winter of the new order have taken their turn telling younger ones the rules. They tell them with the casual authority of those who have never been surprised by cold that thinks. They say keep the ash in a dry jar. They say don't touch the bell tongues with bare hands. They say if a wolf looks at you the way a mother looks at a father, be glad and go inside. They say the dead will not come if you do not call them, and you must never call them, and sometimes the word call is too big for their mouths and they say something like sing. The mothers correct them and then forget to, because the difference between calling and singing is important in songs and not in life. What matters is the bowl of water by the door, and the ember pan by the bed, and a world that has learned to count itself by something other than wounds. The North still tells jokes because joking is the right kind of defiance. The best version of the old one about the man who married a fish has altered very little except in the gesture for cold, which has become more precise and less dramatic. There are new jokes too, many of them about men from the South who come north to pay their debts in wood and discover that wood is not a currency if you have not learned to love it. Wood demands a kind of respect that coins do not, because coins cannot burn your children when your attention wanders. Men who learn this respect become almost locals, and then go home and instruct their neighbors to build better stoves, and the world spins one notch smoother for a day. If you pull aside a certain curtain in a certain room at Winterfell, you will find the bench where the blue-threaded cloaks are kept waiting to be mended. There is always one with its seam open, laid aside as a teaching tool. Apprentices use it to learn strong stitches. No one wears the cloak. It is a practice partner and an emblem. It is said that once, years ago, the queen herself picked up a needle and made 2 stitches in that seam. Some scoff. Queens have other work. But the seam has a little wobble, and women who know thread smile at it like a private joke and continue their straight work. They will teach their daughters to allow for that wobble without trying to fix it. You can insult a tapestry by over-repairing it. The wobble is a reminder that no one makes a line alone, and that even those who do not stand in the cold contribute their hands in ways that matter. In the far north, where stories are made of hard materials and do not smudge, there are rumors of the other things the dead keep from the living. These rumors are useful because they keep men humble. They say that farther than men can see there are cliffs that move and glaciers that sing and spider nests that fold themselves into lace at dawn, and that the figure with the crown that is not a crown walks as he has always walked past these things with a purpose that cannot be narrated. If he is lonely, we do not know it. If he is content, we do not know it. If he is enduring, we know it because the line holds and because wolves sing and because shipwrights plan and because the bells keep their promises. This is one of the few times in a long history that the unknown contents of a king's heart do not matter to his people. What matters is the law of quiet movement he has imposed on winter, and the quiet movement of the living who learned it and made it theirs. On a warm night with flies in the kitchen and laughter on the stair, someone's grandmother will tell a child that once men thought the end of the world was a single event and not the work of hands. The child will find this unconvincing because the end of the world now is clearly a matter of some people quitting too early. The child will ask if the man at the line will ever stop, and the grandmother will say a thing that has no comfort and all the comfort. She will say that stopping is for those who have clocks. Lines are drawn by patience that has forgotten what clocks are for. She will say, eat your ash cake and don't lick your fingers because the salt is for later. She will say, we do not hope now that the line will go away. We hope to deserve it. There will always be some who push at the border just to hear it push back. A boy grows into a lord in the Vale and decides to take his falcons north to watch them fly against the aurora. He wears furs that have never been tested and smiles a great deal. His men bear his pavilion and his wine, and the keeper on duty that night looks at them with tired eyes and points to the ash and says, stand behind it. The lord smirks because he knows what a line is. He sets his birds to flight. One returns at once, one circles and finds a mouse, and one flies farther than pride does. The boy learns how it feels to be too small for a landscape and returns home with a story that is almost humble. He tells it to a girl he likes, and she laughs, and that laughter is a mercy the border gave him too. Those who love endings will complain that none of this gives them one. They will be told in kindness to go to bed. Morning is the ending every night receives, and morning in the north now smells like smoke and something sweet, and the bell sighs, and the wolves sing at a distance that is not dangerous. Bread rises, water runs. Children hold out their hands for ash and smear it on their cheeks in patterns that mean nothing but fun and then grow into those patterns without noticing. A letter arrives from far off with a short line that says the ice has cracked in a new place and another line that says tell the shipwright to use 3 more planks by the prow. The queen reads and nods. The king in the south draws a line with his finger on a map and asks the steward to order more salt and more kettles and more patience. Somewhere very far away the figure who is not a man and not a storm listens to something no one else hears and moves 3 paces to the left. The line holds as if that were the simplest thing a world could do.